In early 1942, Australia faced a crisis that threatened the country's very survival. The relentless advance of the Japanese military across Southeast Asia and the neighboring islands was pushing the front line steadily closer to Australian shores. With every passing day, the war was creeping closer. The Allies were suffering one defeat after another. The reason was not just the enemy's massive numerical advantage, but fatal miscalculations by political and military leadership. Right up until it was almost too late, they were absolutely convinced that the main target of the Japanese attack would be the Soviet Union. They believed the offensive would roll right through China and Mongolia. On top of that, the Allies had disastrously underestimated Japan's actual military capabilities. Even worse, they had practically been arming and funding their future enemy themselves. For years, they had generously supplied the Japanese with state-of-the-art military hardware. This included advanced combat aircraft. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft devastated the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Just 3 days later, the British capital ships HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales were sent to the bottom. This devastating blow effectively paralyzed the British Royal Navy in the region. On just the second day of the Pacific War, the Japanese Army invaded Thailand, already operating with near impunity. They made heavy use of former French military bases in Indochina. Driving down the Malayan Peninsula, the invading force marched right toward the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore. But no miracle materialized. By mid-February, the strategically crucial city was in Japanese hands. Under furious enemy pressure, the Allies were then forced to abandon the Dutch East Indies. In April, Burma fell. This left China completely isolated and cut off from any overland supply routes. By the summer of 1942, the situation had reached a breaking point. It was now painfully obvious that the next major target for a Japanese invasion would likely be Australia. The Australian government took a hard look at its own combat readiness. They began doing everything in their power to brace for a seaborne invasion. But building up a reliable defense proved to be an incredibly difficult task. That really should not come as a surprise. Great Britain had long treated the continent as a dumping ground for obsolete military hardware. Britain had paid almost no attention to the defensive needs of its distant dominion. At the outbreak of the war, the Royal Australian Air Force could only scrape together 2 fighter squadrons. Both of these units saw heavy action in the fierce air battles over Malaya, flying American-built Brewster Buffaloes. The Australian government realized that when the critical moment arrived, they could not count on help from either the United States or Great Britain. Therefore, they made a bold and historic decision. They were going to build their own combat aircraft, relying entirely on domestic industry. The problem was that the country's aviation sector had largely stagnated by the start of the war. This was despite seeing such rapid and promising growth during the 1920s and 30s. The small firms that once formed the backbone of the industry had mostly gone bankrupt due to a limited local market. The only profitable survivor was the Australian branch of de Havilland. This was strictly because they had diversified to produce a wide variety of different products. As it headed into the war, Australia quickly realized the need to build up its own robust aircraft manufacturing industry. Back in 1936, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation was established. They set up their main headquarters in Melbourne. At the same time, a massive aircraft engine plant was built in Lidcombe. The corporation began operations by producing a versatile light aircraft. For their very first airplane, engineers based their design on the highly successful American NA-32 and NA-33 trainers. The first production airplanes rolled off the assembly line in 1937. Upon reaching operational squadrons, this aircraft was officially named the Wirraway. Later on, facing a severe shortage of purpose-built combat aircraft, Australian pilots were forced to fly the Wirraway trainer as a light attack aircraft. They were desperately defending their skies against the enemy onslaught. Meanwhile, Australia's aircraft manufacturing industry continued to scale up. In 1939, they established the Department of Aircraft Production. This department oversaw the mass production of a licensed copy of the British Beaufort torpedo bomber. These bombers were powered by Bristol Taurus engines. However, due to a severe shortage of imported engines and components, Australia had to look for an alternative. They found their solution across the Pacific. They purchased a batch of reliable Pratt & Whitney R-1830 aircraft engines from the United States. These engines were used to power their locally built airplanes. This pivot proved crucial. By early May 1941, the first re-engined Beaufort rolled off the assembly line in Sydney. By December of that year, 7 brand new bombers were deployed straight to frontline squadrons. At that time, this torpedo bomber was the only truly modern combat aircraft available to the Royal Australian Air Force. But the country desperately needed a dedicated fighter. Developing a completely new aircraft from scratch was a daunting challenge. Under wartime conditions, its production had to be entirely independent of imported supplies. The government took a gamble. They immediately ordered 105 production fighters straight off the drawing board. The country's economy simply couldn't afford the luxury of wasting time and resources on building standalone prototypes. The local designers were up against a massive hurdle. They had absolutely no experience designing fighters. Furthermore, the necessary materials and skilled labor were in short supply. So it made perfect sense when the Australian leadership decided not to reinvent the wheel. Instead, they chose to base the new fighter on the already proven and reliable components of the American NA-33. This approach would save them a massive amount of time and effort. Starting in 1942, the Royal Australian Air Force began operating the Wackett trainer. It was named in honor of its chief designer, Lawrence Wackett. In total, the factories rolled out 200 of these aircraft. This trainer was also developed around the NA-33 platform. However, it was significantly smaller and lighter than its predecessor. Engineers used what they called the 180-step method. The core idea was that the robust airframe of the original NA-33 could easily be scaled down without sacrificing any structural integrity. They decided to apply this exact same approach to designing the new fighter. The only difference was that this time the airframe didn't need to be lightened. Instead, it had to be heavily reinforced to withstand the extreme stresses of aerial combat. When it came to choosing an engine for the new fighter, there really weren't many options on the table. The most logical and practical choice was the American Pratt & Whitney R-1830. The big advantage was that this radial engine was already being built under license in Australia for the Beaufort torpedo bombers. This meant the production line was already up and running. The only entirely new component, one that hadn't been fitted to the bombers before, was a 3-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller. Right from the drawing board, both the designers and the military gave the new fighter a fitting and symbolic name, the Boomerang. Work on the airframe started with the wings. The center section was left pretty much as is, but they noticeably shortened the span of the outer wing panels. This dropped the total wing area from 256 down to 225 square feet. At the same time, they significantly beefed up the wing structure. This helped handle high G-forces in combat. Engineers also added large 3-section flaps. This improved low-speed handling on landing. They mostly left the tail section alone. They just reinforced a few key structural elements. Structurally, the fighter's fuselage remained pretty traditional. It was built around a rugged chrome moly steel tube frame. But instead of the fabric covering used on the Wackett trainers, they skinned the new fighter with sturdy duralumin sheets and aircraft-grade plywood. The cockpit was completely redesigned into a single-seat layout. It featured armor plating behind the pilot and a bullet-resistant windscreen. This windscreen was molded from heavy-duty plexiglass. Since the R-1830 pumped out twice the horsepower of the trainer's engine, engineers had to reinforce the engine mount and forward fuselage. The landing gear, however, along with the entire hydraulic retraction system, was carried over straight from the trainer. It was used without a single modification. After all these engineering tweaks, the resulting aircraft had a pretty unique look. It featured a short, stubby nose and a noticeably plump, barrel-shaped fuselage. And even though it was technically a close cousin to the Wirraway trainer, this was a completely different and formidable combat fighter. Just 16 months and 3 days after the project kicked off, test pilot Ken Fruin took the brand new Boomerang to the skies for its maiden flight. This turned a new page in Australian aviation history. It was clear that the main goal, building a fully capable combat aircraft out of a standard trainer, was a total success. The Boomerang had no major flaws. Its flight performance actually exceeded some of its foreign counterparts. For instance, it easily outclassed the American P-64. which was built around that exact same concept. That being said, the challenges the engineers faced while developing the Boomerang were anything but simple. Take the armament, for example. The aircraft was packed with 4 wing-mounted .303 caliber Browning machine guns. These were backed by a hefty ammo supply of 1,000 rounds per gun. These exact same guns were already being used successfully on the Beaufort bombers. Because of this, sourcing them was not an issue at all. However, at high altitudes, those Brownings would simply freeze up and jam. Engineers had to get creative. They designed a specialized hot air heating system for the gun bays just to keep them firing. But when it came to the cannon armament, the situation turned out to be even more complicated. The military absolutely insisted on having 2 20mm Hispano cannons mounted in the wings, close to the fuselage. Each was fed by a 60-round drum magazine. The problem was that Australia did not manufacture these cannons at all, and there was simply nowhere to buy them overseas at the time. But after a long and exhausting search, the Boomerang's design team got incredibly lucky. They managed to find an ordnance manual, the necessary blueprints, and a single working cannon with a magazine. It turned out that a retired sergeant who had fought in North Africa was keeping this weapon right in his own home. During the campaign, the gun had been mounted over the cab of a standard truck as a makeshift anti-aircraft defense. When the sergeant headed back home to Australia, he brought the weapon along as a war souvenir. Engineers immediately reverse-engineered the cannon to create blueprints. A local factory then quickly began mass-producing what was arguably the most crucial component of the new fighter. The CA-12 model turned out to be a surprisingly nimble aircraft. At an altitude of 7,400 feet, it reached 302 miles per hour. And climbing up to 15,500 feet, it hit a top speed of 305 miles per hour. Sure, it could not compete in top speed with the most advanced frontline fighters. However, the Boomerang had an ace in the hole. It had a phenomenal climb rate of nearly 2,900 feet per minute. That was even better than the British Spitfire Mark I or the American P-40E. To reach 20,000 feet, the aircraft needed just over 9 minutes, and its maximum service ceiling was an impressive 34,000 feet. Thanks to its trainer routes, the Boomerang easily outclassed most American fighters of the time in maneuverability. This was clearly proven during mock dogfights against Curtiss P-40E fighters and the latest P-39C Airacobras. A few of these had been delivered to Australia. The American Curtiss could outrun the Aussie fighter in a straight line. But it was hopelessly outclassed in rate of climb and tight turns. Boomerang pilots could effortlessly get on the tail of the P-40E. Although it has to be said that the American plane had a much faster dive speed, this gave its pilots a chance to break off and escape. The Airacobra, on the other hand, was a much more formidable opponent in the sky. But with a skilled pilot at the controls, the Boomerang could fight it on completely equal terms. While the flight trials were underway, the baseline CA-12 prototype was being readied for mass production. Engineers refined the engine cooling system to guarantee sustained maximum power during steep climbs. On top of that, designers repositioned the gun sight for better pilot ergonomics. They also upgraded the wheel brakes and added centerline shackles under the fuselage to carry a drop tank. Importantly, all these technical tweaks and modifications did not negatively impact the excellent flight characteristics of the new fighter. As is usually the case, the very first production aircraft were sent straight to flight schools for pilot training. Cadets and instructors received their first airframes in October 1942. And almost immediately, the first major design flaw became apparent. It turned out that during landing, the Boomerang had a notorious tendency to drop a wing and ground loop. This problem became especially severe in strong crosswind conditions. To be fair, this was entirely expected for an aircraft with such a short, stubby fuselage. This was especially true when paired with a relatively narrow track landing gear. To help the trainees, experienced test pilots were brought to the base. They gave the pilots hands-on demonstrations of a specific technique. They showed how to properly coordinate the rudder and brakes while simultaneously managing the throttle. Mastering this technique was the key to maintaining directional control on the ground. But even with this expert instruction, the ground handling of the aircraft during landing remained its biggest weak point early in its service life. If you read through the squadron records from that era, you will find countless reports of collapsed landing gear. There were also ground loops, scraped wingtips, and other accidents caused by this frustrating design quirk. Initially, the new Boomerang fighters were mostly relegated to flying defensive patrols around Australia. For example, they frequently flew sorties up to Port Moresby in New Guinea. It quickly became clear that the aircraft was best suited for reconnaissance, local air defense, and precision ground attacks. Over New Guinea, Boomerangs regularly escorted Wirraway light attack aircraft. Eventually, they began conducting highly successful strikes on enemy ground positions themselves. Since the fighters were not equipped with bomb racks at the time, pilots relied entirely on their forward-firing guns. Their primary targets during these strafing runs were enemy artillery positions and supply columns. They also targeted the dense jungle canopy that often concealed enemy snipers. The first combat unit to be equipped with the aircraft was the Royal Australian Air Force's 84th Squadron. In early 1943, they were deployed to RAF Base Richmond in New South Wales. The first aircraft arrived on March 2nd. The squadron relocated several times shortly after. First, they moved to Horn Island and then settled at Townsville in Queensland. Their combat operations officially began on April 4th. Pilots regularly patrolled the area around New Guinea. They provided air cover for the Allied base at Morocco. On these sorties, they flew alongside American P-40 fighters from the 86th Fighter Squadron. The Boomerang got its first real taste of combat on April 16, 1943. Two pilots, Stammer and Johnston, intercepted and engaged a flight of 3 Japanese G-4M bombers. The Australians opened fire from a distance of about 250 yards, but at the critical moment, their luck ran out. The guns on one of the Boomerangs jammed. Meanwhile, the other pilot only managed to get off a short burst. The Japanese crews held their nerve. They returned fire from their defensive turrets before quickly disappearing into the night. The 84th Squadron continued operating Boomerangs until September 1943. At that point, the unit transitioned to the P-40. Around the same time, the new fighter entered service with 2 other Australian squadrons. The 89th was based up north in Gove. The 85th was tasked with defending the west coast near Perth. These units strictly flew air defense sorties. They never saw any actual combat. In mid-June 1943, the Royal Australian Air Force's 4th Squadron received its first Boomerangs. By July 1st, the unit was declared fully combat ready. Initially based in Richmond, the squadron later moved to Camden in Victoria. From there, the aircraft deployed to New Guinea. They operated out of airstrips at Port Moresby, Dobodura, Tsili Tsili, Gusap, and Nadzab. The squadron was eventually deployed to Cape Gloucester on the island of New Britain. There, the Australian pilots were tasked with providing close air support for U.S. Marine Corps units. But operating alongside American forces turned out to be pretty complicated and full of nasty surprises. The problem was that the Boomerang's silhouette closely resembled Japanese fighters. This regularly led to some really dangerous situations. For instance, on July 7, 1943, American anti-aircraft gunners made a tragic mistake. They shot down a Boomerang flown by pilot officer John Francis Collier. Another time, an American P-38 Lightning actually engaged in a full-blown dogfight with an Australian fighter and shot it up. The Australian pilot was forced to make an emergency crash landing. The aircraft hit a ditch at high speed and nosed right over. The airframe was a complete write-off. Luckily, the pilot walked away without a scratch. By the very next morning, he was already filing some highly justified complaints with the Americans over the whole incident. In actual combat, Boomerangs almost never got into classic dogfights with Japanese aircraft. Their primary role became close air support for ground troops. Simply put, they had to find enemy ground targets. They would mark them and, whenever possible, take them out themselves. A flight of 8 Boomerangs and 4 Wirraways provided absolutely incredible support. They assisted the 7th and 9th Infantry Divisions during the heavy fighting in New Guinea. Their tactics were incredibly daring. The Boomerangs would make their attack runs at extremely low altitudes. They literally skimmed rooftop level over village huts. They would blow right past the heads of completely stunned Japanese anti-aircraft gunners and instantly drop smoke markers. That thick smoke gave incoming bombers and artillery a perfect aiming point. Since the Boomerangs couldn't carry a heavy bomb load themselves, they were often followed closely by American P-40E fighters loaded with bombs. If an enemy target was camouflaged a bit too well, the Australians would just hose it down with tracers. This marked the exact spot for the strike. Thanks to those gutsy tactics, the CA-12 aircraft played an incredibly important role in this campaign. They turned out to be so accurate that they were used to take out lone enemy snipers hiding in mountain ravines or the attics of buildings. The pilots of No. 4 Squadron were known as the Boomer Boys. They earned a massive amount of respect from the infantry. It is worth noting that Boomerang losses to enemy aircraft were actually quite low. This was largely thanks to the excellent maneuverability of the airplane. But those brutal jungle operating conditions really took their toll. Just about every production aircraft suffered from ongoing mechanical issues to some degree. As for No. 5 Squadron, they received their fighters in July 1943. They became fully combat ready by early November. At first, these aircraft were stationed at RAAF Base Laverton in Victoria. Later, they were transferred up to the Toowoomba Airfield in Queensland. Eventually, after a lot of moving around and hopping between bases, the squadron ended up on Bougainville. That is where these fighters saw some extremely fierce combat against heavily entrenched Japanese troops. At this stage of the war, the Boomerangs acted as spotters for the heavy-hitting F-4U Corsairs flying with the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Before this, the Corsair pilots were not having much luck. They had a really hard time navigating and spotting well-camouflaged enemy positions in the dense jungle. But the second the Boomerangs joined the mix, the effectiveness of the New Zealand squadrons skyrocketed. They started delivering some seriously impressive results. As the fighting finally came to a close in August 1945, Boomerang crews took on humanitarian missions. They began dropping leaflets over the jungle, informing Japanese soldiers that their empire had surrendered. However, the harsh tropical climate took a heavy toll on the aircraft. By November, most of these fighters were completely grounded due to the relentless heat and humidity. The Wirraways suffered a similar fate. Mechanics were forced to cannibalize these aircraft for spare parts right on the flight line. No. 83 Squadron also saw its share of action. They received their first Boomerang on July 12, 1943. They achieved operational status by September 16th. The unit was redeployed frequently. They started out at Strathpine in Queensland. Then they moved up to Milingimbi in the Northern Territory. This was followed by deployments to Gove, Camden, and finally Menangle in New South Wales. Like most squadrons flying these rugged fighters, No. 83 Squadron spent most of its time flying continuous defensive patrols to protect the local airspace. In June 1943, the Fisherman's Bend aircraft plant wrapped up production of 105 CA-12 fighters. Without delay, the factory transitioned immediately into assembling the upgraded variant, the CA-13. Externally and aerodynamically, this new Boomerang did not look or fly all that differently from its predecessor. The most significant changes were internal. For example, they used standard plywood for the wing skins instead of scarce duralumin. Also, the wingtips were made entirely out of wood. Another notable feature of the CA-13 was its complex exhaust system, adopted directly from the Beaufort bomber. They also replaced the fabric covering on the rudder and ailerons with more durable duralumin. To improve pilot situational awareness, a rear-view mirror was added to the canopy. Additionally, the complex hydraulic gun charging system was replaced with a reliable mechanical linkage. Designers aimed to improve the fighter's high-altitude performance above 12,500 feet. This was the critical altitude for its R-1830 engine. To achieve this, a General Electric exhaust-driven turbocharger was fitted to a production airframe. Along with the turbocharger, the aircraft received a redesigned, much more aerodynamic cowling. The wing root fairings were also refined. The turbocharger itself was mounted on the right side, just behind the cockpit, with the air intake placed on the left. During its initial test flights, this new variant, dubbed the CA-14, showed significant performance gains. Its top speed above 13,100 feet increased by 20%. But it wasn't all good news. The heavy turbocharger shifted the aircraft's center of gravity dangerously far aft. Furthermore, during hard maneuvers, the new air intake disturbed the airflow over the tail. This severely degraded handling. This forced the engineers back to the drawing board. The air intake was relocated under the cowling. The intake pipe was routed between the cockpit and the outer skin on the left side. This gave the aircraft a distinctively asymmetrical profile. A multi-blade cooling fan was also fitted directly in front of the engine. This updated fighter was designated the CA-14A, and it featured a redesigned tail section as well. Subsequent test flights at Laverton were highly successful and demonstrated significant potential. However, by 1944, the Allies already had an abundance of capable high-altitude fighters. Consequently, the unique CA-14A never progressed beyond the prototype stage, and only a single airframe was ever built. The final production version of the legendary Boomerang was the CA-19. Only 45 of these fighters ever rolled off the assembly line. For this final variant, the designers upgraded the landing gear with newer, much tougher Dunlop wheels. They also aerodynamically cleaned up the airframe as much as possible. They stripped the fuselage of minor protrusions that proved completely useless in combat. Another notable addition was a fixed F-24 camera installed in the tail section of many of these aircraft. This let the pilots pull double duty. They could snap crucial tactical recon photos right in the middle of their combat sorties. Without a doubt, the Boomerang went down in history as one of the best combat aircraft ever developed and mass-produced in Australia. This fighter earned a tremendous amount of respect not only from its pilots, but also from the infantry. For the ground troops, this close air support fighter became a real flying bulldozer. It literally cleared a path for them through the dense, impenetrable tropical jungle. Unfortunately, time is rarely kind to vintage aircraft. By the end of the 20th century, only one original example of this famous fighter remained. This was a CA-12 that had once served with No. 85 Squadron. Interestingly, after the war ended in 1945, this specific airframe became a genuine movie star. It was used during the filming of Smithy, a movie detailing the fascinating life of the legendary Australian aviator Charles Kingsford Smith. In the film, the Boomerang stood in for a completely different aircraft, the renowned Lockheed Altair, named the Lady Southern Cross. When filming wrapped up, the fighter was handed over to the Australian Air League. It spent about 20 years there, taking a real beating from vandals and the elements. Eventually, the decision was made to rescue this deteriorating piece of history. A C-130 Hercules transport carefully airlifted the remains of the fighter to Williamtown. There, after a long and incredibly complex restoration process, this sole surviving Boomerang was finally brought back to life. It became a proud display piece at the local museum. It now stands as a reminder of a remarkable chapter in Australian aviation history.